Hello, everyone. So, Europe is currently experiencing a wave of political tension driven by pressure from migration crisis, geopolitical crisis, and the rise of nationalism, thus fueling rearmament and arms proliferation. The question now is, will the chaos in Europe affect Africa? So, Africa is a vulnerable continent faced with different challenges ranging from political to humanitarian crisis. In the situation of a third world war, and its aftermath, what is likely to be the fate of Africa? Although Africa has more sovereign states today, weak institutions and elite corruption makes it vulnerable to the 21st century exploitation camouflaged as partnership. Now let's go down the memory lane and see what lessons can be learned from history. Going back to the Peace Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which was signed in Munster and Osnabrück to end the 80 Years' War in Europe. This war left an indelible mark on Africa. Of course, the war was not fought in Africa, but the aftermath of the war witnessed a surge in the transatlantic slave trade, which led to population loss, economic disruption, with local economy being undermined, emotional trauma, and abrupt pause in the socio-economic life of the peoples of Africa. Moving forward, in 1870, the rising tension among powers in Europe led to the scramble for and consequently the partition of Africa. After the Berlin Conference, which was held between November 1884 and February 1885, this created artificial border, which has remained a major cause of conflict among African countries today. Subsequently, this rivalry, among other factors, led to the First World War in 1914 among the European powers, after which Africa experienced colonialism. Apart from economic exploitation, there was a disruption of traditional governance, with many kingdoms and empires collapsing. Africa's resources were exploited for the benefit of the local industries in the metropolis. Colonies were forced to grow raw materials for the industries in Europe, thus making the economies of African states to be dependent on global price fluctuation. On the heels of this was the Second World War, which began in 1939 and ended in 1945. Now, to wage this war, African resources were not only plundered for the execution of the war, Africans became human shield for their erstwhile colonizers. After the Second World War ended in 1945, Africa's economy by then had been conditioned to be dependent on imported goods. At independence, most countries in Africa were on board the new colonial vessel, which was commandeered by the Bretton Woods institutions, with its policies of structural adjustment program that involves subsidy removal on essential goods, currency devaluation, privatization, and commercialization, among other instruments. African states began to regain their independence, beginning with Egypt, followed closely by Ghana, and then subsequently in the 60s, many African states regained their independence. However, the independence was only political because they had lost economic control to the international financial institutions regulated by the Bretton Woods institutions. These newly independent states were riddled with political instability, which were often with foreign coloration. The likes of Patrice Lumumba's ouster and assassination in 1960 in a military coup that brought in Joseph Desire Mobutu into power for 32 years in Congo, the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana in 1966, the Angola's civil war of 1975, the assassination of Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso in 1987, and NATO-backed overthrow of President Muammar Gaddafi of Libya in 2011. The activities of NATO in Libya led to the creation and exportation of terrorism to the rest of Africa, especially the Sahel. As African states records destruction, Western powers smiled to their bank accounts from the proceeds made from the sales of weapons and munitions. The ongoing Russo-Ukrainian War, which began in February 2020, and the continuous fanning of the embers of this operation by the West had profound implications on Africa. This war exposed Africa's vulnerabilities, considering its effect on energy markets, food security, geopolitics, and economic stability. Considering the fact that Africa imports 30% of our wheat from the two warring states of Ukraine and Russia, the war had caused price spike to the tune of 50% in some countries and in others more. Also, the prices of fertilizer from these two countries have equally affected local food production, thus making food availability and utility difficult for many Africans, which of course might also affect the SDG's goal of zero hunger by 2030. Although some African countries like Nigeria and Kenya claim they had designed a rescue plan for their nationals from food scarcity, the result is yet to be seen. Also, there is a global surge in the price of crude, thus raising fuel costs among some African countries and also causing protests. Protests in Nigeria, for instance, protests in Kenya, in Angola, which happened just recently because of subsidy removal from fuel price. The ongoing military operation between Russia and Ukraine had increased insecurity in Africa as a result of the proliferation of smuggled weapons into Libya, Sudan, the Sahel, some part of Nigeria, and some other parts of Africa. Although African countries have diversified their alliances, African countries right now are balancing alliance between Russia, China on the one hand, and the West on the other hand, so as to avoid overdependence. Since the war started in 2022, the West had spent an estimated total of 164 billion plus euro to support Ukraine with military aid and humanitarian aid. The EU is committed to sustained support with additional funds from member states targeting 5% of their GDP. Now, how long the operation would last for is not known, but when it does end, many Western economies could be worse off. Considering the fact that some Western economies are already grappling with inflation at the moment. Considering Western antecedents with double standards, in the event of a Third World War and global economic instability, could it mean colonization 2.0 for Africa, or has African states been able to diversify their economies enough to avoid being caught in Western chaos? These and many more questions come to mind. What is your take? Please drop your comments and don't forget to like and subscribe. Till next time. Bye.